Hello there. We're continuing our question and answer session today, and because there were several about Julius Caesar, I thought I'd roll them all into one video, because several are similar in the topic they want me to talk about, and others are related. You can hear Augustus the cat chipping in there in the background. He obviously thinks this ought to be an Augustus video, but I'm afraid protests of Burman cats notwithstanding, let's go ahead with my plan. So we're going to talk about different aspects of Caesar, mainly from the questions that have been posted in the comments section as part of this 2025 Q&A session, but also some of the comments that have come to earlier videos or comments to comments. Even when I don't get to reply, I do try and read all of those and react. So the broad theme today is reflected really in some of the questions like this. So Caesar, was he a man of the people, disgusted by a corrupt empire, a visionary, or just a megalomaniac tyrant? Was he just desperate? Why didn't he purge his enemies once in power? Overconfidence in his charm? Too squeamish? Too soft? Similar. Was Caesar a friend of the Republic who wanted to save it? Or was he really an enemy of the state in search for absolute power? So what's my take on the matter? Another one, was it Caesar's intention to destroy the Republic, create a new autocratic political order? And then there's another one we'll come to later on, about the events after Caesar's death. Did they turn on Caesar? Were they still on his side? What do the sources say? So we'll look at all of those and a couple of others that, as I say, have cropped up along the way. So today is very much Julius Caesar, and in a sense, we're going to be trying to ask questions that have been asked since the ancient world. What was the impact of Caesar? How important was he? Was he a good thing or a bad thing for Rome, for the Republic, for the wider world? It's interesting that the actual passage of Livy's history isn't preserved, but Seneca later quotes in a discussion in a book on nature. He says, "What has been commonly said about the elder Caesar and is recorded by Titus Livius, that it cannot be decided whether it was better for the Commonwealth for him to be born or never to be born, this can also be said about the winds." It's very much making Caesar a force of nature. It's like the storms, the winds that can do harm but can do good. Again, they can blow in the bad weather or they can blow it away. They can destroy a house when it's violent, but they can also clear things, they can help. There is that sense of Caesar is a little bit different from what comes. It's Caesar Augustus who builds the Principate and does so in a different way. So anyway, we'll come back to all of these things, but the point is we are dealing with topics that have been discussed since Caesar's lifetime and during Caesar's lifetime. But obviously it's easier to make a more rational judgment on someone afterwards. If you listen to political debate these days, you can believe that almost everybody, leaders of a major party, is an enemy of the state, an enemy of the people, an enemy of democracy, because the other side, that particularly when they're losing, tend to say that of him or her. You don't necessarily have to believe it all. All of these things are coming from a certain point of view, from a particular perspective. Before we get on to Caesar, his career, his ambitions, what he was trying to do, there was another comment about my use of the photographs of the bust from Arles that has been identified as Julius Caesar and was discovered, what, a decade or so ago now, maybe slightly longer. To me, it's one of the new ones, rather than the Tusculum bust and others. The basic reason for this is that I've got my own photographs of the Arles bust. I've seen that one in the flesh and been able to take pictures of it. The others I haven't. The others I'm taking copies from elsewhere. And while YouTube is pretty rough and ready when it comes to copyright, and most of these things will come under the sort of the fair use idea that I'm simply illustrating a point, I'm not claiming ownership of this image, I'm always more comfortable when I can use my own stuff. So I do use other people's as well, and obviously particularly in the videos on film and TV, there's lots of vidcaps taken from DVDs and the like of those. In this case, this is something I've got color images of it. It also reflects my own shifting opinions, in that when this was first published, when it was first reported and people were saying this is Julius Caesar, I looked at the photographs I saw in the newspaper and thought, no, it's not. This is someone with a much rounder face. Yes, probably the same period. It has that style about it of a 1st century BC or very early 1st century AD. It hasn't got the big influence, the changes in artistic style you'll get during and after the Augustan era. But it doesn't look like Caesar to me. And then I was doing some filming in the museum for, I can't remember, it was a series. I think it was one of the episodes was on Caesar, one was on gladiatorial games. I remember being stuck up a tower above the amphitheatre at Arles, and they insisted that I just wear the shirt that I'd been wearing when we'd last filmed in the height of summer in the Forum. And it was bitterly cold up there, but that was the way it had to be in this same yellow-orange shirt, I think it was, that had been bought for me by the costume people, because they frowned upon my traditional wardrobe. And it was just really, really cold. And the excuse given, the reason for all of this was that, well, if you don't wear the same clothes, the audience won't know who you were, which I suppose is the sort of principle of so many cartoon characters over the years, that they're always dressed exactly the same way. Anyway, apart from that, we were filming in the museum. We were looking at this thing, and I got a chance to have a real good close look at it. The thing that surprised me that I hadn't realized from the pictures is that it's asymmetric. So from one side, this looks like a very round-faced individual, more sort of my shape of face. From the other side, it looks much more like the other famous and well-recognized bust of Julius Caesar. It's a much slimmer face, it's got some of the lines. So that's a bit of a shock. To me, it suggests that the thing was probably positioned in a corner, sort of, you know, alcove type thing. And they expect you to look at it more from one direction from the other, unless it is actually a, you know, representation of a chap who did have a slightly asymmetric face. So seeing it in the flesh, as it were, I actually thought, well, this could be Julius Caesar. I don't think I'd go any further than that. I think it could be, probably odds on that it's actually some local bigwig in the city there who wants to be depicted as looking like Julius Caesar, or who is aping the hairstyle, the look, the expression of Caesar in the way, you know, people follow fashion. And Julius Caesar had been a trendsetter in terms of hairstyle, loose girdle on his tunic so that it hangs down longer, long sleeves on his tunic. A lot of the styles that you get talked about as those of the sort of the young rakes in Rome, the people associated with Catiline and all that sort of thing, have started with Julius Caesar. This is a man with style, this is someone you copy, but of course there are probably other people doing it as well, but he's the famous name that adopts this. You know, it's the JFK not wearing a hat, the standard argument that stops men all over the world wearing hats, which is far too simplistic, but it's clearly a contributory factor to that pretty major change. Not the only one, not the only person doing that, but nevertheless it's there. You know, even James Bond in those opening sequences moves from having a hat in the first view to being bareheaded from then on. So I use that image, as I say, because I've got my own pictures of it and I can paste those in, and then I don't feel guilty that I'm denying somebody copyright. And I use it because it could be Caesar, but I'm not claiming that this definitively is, and others have probably, you know, we can be much more confident that they actually are Caesar, that look. One of the big problems with the ancient world is that you have these busts, these statues that survive. Often they're found in the Renaissance or a little later. Everybody wanted to have somebody famous in their collection. Now, on the one hand, you're more likely to get a painting of, or sculpture, an image of somebody famous than somebody you don't know. You know, think how many posters there would be of pop stars, rather fewer of those individuals within your family or friends that you've printed up and put up yourself on that size. So this sort of formal image is more likely to be somebody famous, but there's lots of famous people out there to one degree or other. You know, are you famous for 10 square miles from where you're born or where you're city councillor or this sort of thing, or are you famous in the Caesar sense, the Augustus sense, all over the Roman world, in some cases beyond? So a lot of the identifications we tend to use, I find myself both as an author in books and on these videos, using images that may or may not actually be the person they're supposed to be. And the Hannibal one is a classic example. We can be fairly confident with a lot of the Alexander ones. Augustus, of course, promotes his own image, projects it everywhere. From then on, you can start to test the image of Augustus and later emperors by comparison with their coins, with all the other imagery that comes out. And the advantage of the coins is, of course, they're usually labeled, we know exactly who it is. So that's just starting with Julius Caesar, which is one of the reasons we can be so confident, and the fact that there are several buts. There's one of Crassus, really, one of Cato, Uticensis, one of Brutus, one, maybe two of Antony. That most of these people are only recorded in one that we think might be. Think of the Cleopatra question. One day perhaps I'll go back to that video I did ages ago about her appearance, and with more freedom put in more images of the things I was talking about to make that a bit stronger. But again, there's so much guesswork. We desperately want to have images of these people. We want to know what they look like. There's this stuff going on in the papers at the moment that a famous portrait of Marie Antoinette is actually her sister. I don't know the ins and outs of that, not my period. You just never quite know, and you can get these people who look a bit like the person in question because they're from the same era, they're dressed, their hairstyle is similar, or because they're deliberately, consciously copying that person. Either way, it's often very hard. So I'm certainly not going up there to stand there and say 100% the Arles bust is Caesar. I think it could be, which I didn't think until I actually saw the thing for real. But I'll use it because I've got the pictures, and as I say, I'm always much more comfortable using things that I've taken myself. So anyway, that was that one question. A few people raised it in the comment section. There was a broader question on imagery and identifying people and artistic styles, this sort of thing. Maybe we'll go into that another day, but I need to prepare enough images to support it so we can actually see what we're talking about. Anyway, let's go on to Caesar and what he was trying to do. What was the ambition of Caesar's life? That's obviously not a simple thing. There is a tradition within the ancient sources that comes out in Suetonius in particular, often with quotes associated with Catullus, that Caesar is aiming for supremacy, perhaps dictatorship, something like that, monarchy even, from the word go. Even as a teenager, this kid is out there to get to the very top. So for instance, you have the story of when Caesar has been a hunted man during Sulla's dictatorship because he refused to divorce his wife, daughter of Cinna, leading opponent of Sulla. And he has to bribe his way to be released at one point. He catches malaria while he's hiding in the swamps, is eventually caught, is eventually pardoned because of pressure from his mother and her relatives, other Julii Caesares. At several removes, they're in a different voting tribe, they're very distant cousins to our Julius Caesar, the famous one. They persuade Sulla that this youngster isn't a threat and can safely be pardoned, and then various quotes are attributed to Sulla that there's more than one Marius in this boy. It's your beard on your own head sort of thing. That sense. Later you have when quite early in his career Caesar is standing for election, and particularly the Pontifex Maximus case, which we'll come to again in a minute and look at in more detail another day. Catullus, the man who loses out, the senior senator, father of the Senate, talks about Caesar's. It's not just that he's invested the city, he's beginning to bring up his siege engines, this sort of thing. So you have this later tradition that does seem to be based on hindsight, that this is what Caesar's going to do, this is what Caesar always wants to do. He wants to get to the very top, and he will do anything to get there. But again, come back to the present day and think of a lot of the muck that is thrown at rival politicians by their opponents, but also by the supporters of their opponents, and the people who just don't like them. And obviously in the age of the internet, all vitriol has become much, much stronger. Because you can get away with it. You can scream and shout at somebody on the web and nobody's going to punch you. Do that in public, you might be in a bit more trouble, but even in public, if you find a group of like-minded people, you can say all sorts of appalling things and then be utterly shocked if somebody says any criticism of you at all. So don't assume that's new, that people haven't been acting like that throughout the ages. We love to think we're right, and for many people the possibility that they could be wrong. Thank you, Augustus the cat. I'm not sure whether the microphone's picking that up or not, but he's outside in the hallway yelling for some particular reason. I'm not quite sure. He often does this in the morning. I think he wants to announce himself in various ways. Anyway, so you do have this tradition that Caesar is always pushing for more than an exceptional career. He's pushing for supremacy. And you have this developed in Meyer's biography, where Caesar is the outsider, somebody who can look at the senatorial class, see it for what it is, corrupt, inefficient, and want to replace it. He doesn't feel part of it. But there isn't a lot of evidence for that you can actually pin down to those earlier periods. Now, Caesar isn't talked about too much in the early stages of his life in the surviving documents because he wasn't particularly important. He is a young aristocrat. He's a patrician. Those are a minority. The vast majority of the Senate, even of the Senate's elite by this time, are from plebeian families, and many of them are every bit or more aristocratic than any patrician. Caesar's branch of the Julii Caesares hasn't done well in politics for a very long time. His father starts to have the makings of a career and then dies young. So there was one generation earlier, things are starting to improve, but they haven't produced a consul for centuries. So he's someone from an aristocratic family. His aunt was married to Marius, so there's a connection with somebody who's been big, but obviously is very controversial in recent years. But again, a new man, not someone from the old established elite. Julius Caesar was not born to the consulship in a way that some of the members of some of the big families are. Most of the Metelli, they're going to get there. And Claudi Marcelli, and so there are other groups around there that you see these names again and again in the fasti, the list of the consuls. Caesar isn't part of that. So you have to, if you're going to think that he's always decided the res publica is decadent, inefficient, or that even if it's okay, I can think of a better way of doing it with me at the top, then it's assuming an awful lot. It's assuming even more self-confidence than this man clearly possessed. And Caesar clearly does believe in himself. And one of the things that he displays consistently throughout his life is he's got a lot of talent. Now, this person is very good at doing most things. Wins the Corona Civica when he's young, first military service. That's quite a rare decoration in this period. Later on in the 70s, studying as a student, he raises the militias of some of the cities in Asia to beat off a raiding party of Mithridates on his own, private citizen. Apart from those couple of years as a junior staff officer, no military experience whatsoever. The episode with the pirates, however, you must realize it's spun in a way that's favorable to Caesar. Nevertheless, that's somebody who can again cajole, bully, persuade the cities into raising a little squadron of ships and going and chasing these people down. That's quite something. You've also got the oratory. He's a very gifted speaker. He is very active as an advocate in court, and even though he doesn't necessarily win so many cases, he comes out pretty well out of it. He shows that he's committed to some of these causes, and also that he is a very able speaker. It's just the big guns are against him, and you can't win them all. The establishment favors his opponents, the defense, and so when he's prosecuting governors for corruption and this sort of thing, he can make a very good case, but you're still not going to win. We tend to forget Caesar, the author beyond the commentaries. This is a man who also wrote a textbook on grammar. He wrote poetry, generally judged, none of it survived to have been fairly mediocre poetry, but nevertheless he's doing it. And there's the charm, whether it's seducing a crowd, whether it's seducing other people's wives, all of these things. Caesar has a lot of talent, and you can see that in the scale of organization, all that goes on as dictator. And even if, as we say, the calendar, he's finding experts and letting them loose and saying, this is the problem, this is what I want solved, how best do we do it? There is a talent in finding the right people. It's an elusive talent, as many politicians these days find. You often think this person's going to be very good, and they aren't, or the difficulties involved make it impossible for them to fulfill all the promises they've made, this sort of thing. So Caesar is very talented. Caesar is immensely self-confident. Caesar wants a distinguished career. That is abundantly obvious from the start because he does try for political office and he goes big. The Pontifex Maximus case we'll come back to again, where he stands for Rome's senior priesthood in these peculiarly organized specific elections and wins. Now he spends money to make himself famous. He spends money to win friends, bribe voters, if you want to put it that way. But both the ambition and the methods are not out of keeping with the way the Roman political system works. They're fairly typical. Caesar does it better. He doesn't do it fundamentally differently. So Caesar is ambitious, just as you have Brutus saying in the Shakespeare's version and Antony criticizing. Caesar wants distinction, wants high office, wants fame, wants the fortune that comes with it. So does every young senator, just about. You have the odd dropout, the one who decides to become a poet, the one, or somebody like Atticus, who probably could have had a political career, would have been hard, but nevertheless possible, knows everybody politically, but always wants to be out of the Senate, to the side, not directly involved, and knows everybody, so he comes out a winner even when he's been associated with the liberators, the conspirators who murdered Julius Caesar. He's also in favor with Augustus and his entourage and extended family. Atticus's daughter marries Agrippa. She's the mother of Vipsania, of the divorce with Tiberius fame, and the I Claudius scenes. Even got cited in an episode of Frasier, didn't it? The original version of the comedy once, which I suspect from I Claudius, but nevertheless, good on them. So you have, yes, ambition, yes, you want high office, and yes, you parade yourself around, you try and make friends, you spend money to make yourself popular, and in Caesar's case, you're borrowing a lot of this money. So you're putting yourself in debt in the expectation, or at the very least hope, that you will win high office and recover that money, be able to pay back your creditors as you go along. And your creditors are investing in you because they think you're a good enough bet. I mean, it is a little bit like buying stocks in a politician, a lot of this. And again, Caesar is not the only one in receipt of such loans. And later on, when he does have his fortune from Gaul, he invests in people like Curio, Caelius, plenty of others. Get gifts from Caesar, get favorable loans, all the sorts of things that Crassus has been doing before, and others as well. Roman politics works on this basis of trading favors, and some of it is in clear financial arrangements. Here's this money, I'll want it back, but I don't want it back too soon. I'll get the interest from you either as in addition to the return of the loan, or you're going to do this for me when you're in office. Favors and trade in that sort of way. None of this is unusual in any way. Caesar has a pretty standard career for the first 40 years of his life. He doesn't really do anything exceptional. He is not, there have been revolutions in 78 after Sulla's resignation, when one of the consuls raises an army, rebels, is suppressed, is executed. That's when Brutus's father is executed in the aftermath of fighting. So somebody from a family like that has backed this rogue consul. You've still had Sertorius going off fighting in Spain. Caesar hasn't rushed off to join him. While there are rumors, clearly at the time as well, judging from Cicero's speeches, that Caesar had associations with Catiline and the conspirators, he is very clearly not involved. He's not held to be responsible. A lot of people who don't like him or see him as an annoying little tick, far too ambitious for his own good, far too flamboyant for his own good, and apart from that, he seduced my wife or my brother's wife or whoever it might be, my half-sister in the case of Cato. I don't like this man, but he's not accused directly, he is not convicted. Overall, balance of probability is that yes, he knew Catiline and many of the leading conspirators, as did Cicero, as did Cato, as did everybody else, because the Senate is a small world, and may have shared some sympathy with some of the causes that they promoted. He's not involved. He isn't a revolutionary in those early years. He follows a fairly normal path along the cursus honorum, along this route of offices, to be elected tribune, first of all, late 70s, quaestor, aedile, at which he's very flamboyant, again, borrows lots of money, puts on really spectacular games, adds in funeral games for his father who died a very long time before, gets elected to the praetorship, and that's happening at the time of the Catilinarian conspiracy, when that's all coming out. So this has already happened. He's been part of that cycle of elections in 63 to take up office the following year. So he has done very well, but he's getting these offices when he first becomes eligible. That's a sign of success. It isn't a sign of somebody who's a revolutionary. And of course, Catiline's shift into revolution comes after successive failures to be elected consul in the normal way. What he would have done as consul, who knows? But it's only at that last stage when he raises an army and rebels. And even then, he's trying to be part of the establishment, trying to be part of the system. But Caesar's conventional. He's done everything flamboyantly. His name is talked about. You know, poor old Calpurnius Bibulus, who's his contemporary, comes up for office at the same age, each time ends up as Caesar's colleague in all these offices, eventually in the consulship as well, and is consistently outshone because Caesar's got style, Caesar's got charisma, Caesar's got fame, and he hasn't. You know, he's a bit of a plodder. He's average, he's at best, and he just doesn't have that style. And again, you will notice the way, even if there's an element of sort of horrible fascination, how the media today will talk a lot more about some people than others. And some politicians just come across as a bit boring and they're not worth reporting on, however good a job they're doing. Others attract attention all the time. And because they know that if people see that face or hear that voice, they will tune in, they will read, they will watch and pay attention. And those might well be critics of that individual. Oh, it's what's this fool said now, that sort of thing. It's like there was a Yes Minister joke, wasn't there, that notoriety is better than obscurity as far as a politician's concerned. So even the bad stories that are told about Caesar, you know, this guy can't keep his, I was going to say his trousers on, but of course we're Romans, his tunic on, is chasing everything in a skirt, which of course also becomes a complicated in the Roman context when everybody's wearing tunics, everything in a dress, shall we say. You know, he has all these scandalous affairs with other men's wives, and the wives of very prominent senators like Pompey, like Crassus. That gossip is there, but it means people know who he is. And the fact we alluded to earlier, that he has his shaggy hair, that he wears his tunic low, long sleeves, you notice Caesar. There are these people who have that knack that in any group they stand out. They've got that star quality, which he clearly has. He's not going to be the only one like that, but it is particularly marked with Caesar. So Caesar's career is conventional. There is no sign at all in the early years that he is plotting revolution, that he wants to be dictator. He can be depicted as ambitious in his standing for the office of Pontifex Maximus, spending all this money. You know, you have the story attributed to him that he talks to his mother on the morning of the election as he heads off to see what's going to happen and says, well, I'll either come back as a victor or I'm not coming home at all, because he's borrowed so much that if he fails, then his career's over, because people will realize I've invested in this, the bubbles burst. There isn't going to be Caesar, the proconsul, who's going to make loads of money conquering some people or other and pay me back and have all the opportunity to do me favors, this sort of thing. That isn't going to happen. Therefore, let's pull the money out, let's save what I can at this stage, dun him for whatever I can get rather than lose everything. He wins. It's seen as surprising because Catulus, who is this very distinguished, much older senator, is also standing for the post. However, the details aren't really there, but there's a good case to be made that the most prominent senator doesn't always win elections like this. That there have been other cases where somebody who might be seen as a bit of an outsider has been chosen by the slightly peculiar and varying organization of selected voting groups, not the normal tribes and centuries that are chosen to, not the normal assemblies that are chosen to elect this specific religious post. So Caesar wins that, it's flamboyant, but again, becoming Pontifex Maximus is not such a big deal. It doesn't give you vast power. It's very useful, it's very prestigious, there are certain things on which you decide, and it adds to the authority of your voice, but you know, we don't hear much about what Caesar does as Pontifex Maximus at any stage. And in fact, the main thing is the scandal involving Clodius sneaking in disguised as a woman to the Bonadea, the all-female festival held in the Regium, the palace that's occupied by the Pontifex Maximus while Caesar's out, to have an affair with Caesar's wife. allegedly, that leads to a trial in which Caesar will not give evidence, but he's already divorced his wife, leading to the famous, well, you know, if you're not going to testify against this bloke, why did you do that? He said, because Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. That comment. So, up until then, when we're getting into the 60s, Caesar hasn't done anything really that out of the ordinary, certainly not revolutionary in any way whatsoever. There's no sign of it. And remember, he's, you know, pushing 40 by the time he goes off to Spain as pro-praetor, following on from his praetorship, does well there, fights an aggressive campaign, raises troops, not well recorded in our sources, but he gets voted a triumph. He seems to act there as he will do in Gaul. So in Spain, Caesar will do, at least give the impression he's doing much the same sort of thing he'll do later in his, from his point of view, highly successful proconsulship in Gaul. He returns to Rome, wants to stand for the consulship, but also wants to have his triumph. Cato, other people are opposing him. They don't fancy this, partly because his brother-in-law is Bibulus, so he wants Bibulus to succeed. Sorry, son-in-law is Bibulus. He wants the family to succeed rather than this flamboyant guy who might take all the votes, because, you know, you never know with these consular elections. Bibulus has done well so far, but everything gets harder. There are plenty of praetorships. There are only those 2 consulships. You know, Caesar makes a deal with another man to stand on the same ticket. The other fella contributes money but doesn't get in. So there is opposition to doing this, and Cato in particular helps to block a vote that would have allowed Caesar to stand for the consulship without actually crossing the Pomerium to come into the city, so that he could celebrate his triumph as well in the months to come. Caesar then surprises them, gives up the right to a triumph, comes in, stands for the consulship, wins. So he's given up one of the greatest honours a Roman politician can have in the expectation that he will get the same or better in the future. You've got the arrangement with with Pompey and Crassus. Brutus coming from that reason. I suppose Pompey killed his father, but other than that, can't quite see how my mind's going that way. Anyway, you have so-called First Triumvirate. Again, we've talked about this in The Conquered and the Proud and elsewhere, and no doubt we'll do more so over the years to come. That's a political alliance for the convenience of all 3, of which Caesar is the junior partner at the start. Crassus and Pompey are both very rich, very well established. Crassus has been loaning Caesar money for some time. He's saved him from being bankrupt before he went out to Spain. So he's been investing in sort of stocks of Julius Caesar basically for a long time. Both Pompey and Crassus are frustrated. There are things they want that have been blocked in the Senate. Other people, Pompey has had a couple of his men elected consul in the last few years. Afranius, for instance, who'll figure in the Civil War, hasn't been able to get what he wanted. Caesar does, but Caesar forces it through. There is an escalation of methods on each side. Begins with the land law that Caesar introduces in January 59 BC. He presents it first to the Senate. He's written it with great care. Again, Caesar the legislator, the man able to craft law extremely well. Quite a few of Caesar's laws will last for centuries, just in the same way that many of Pompey's regulations for the eastern provinces also endure, because they're basically sound. You know, the job was done well in the first place. Caesar presents this to the Senate, says, look, I can change anything if you've got strong objections, but this is an important thing. There is this need, I want to get it through, and is told by Cato and others, you know, don't care, the law's fine, but I don't like you, I'm going to oppose it, I'm going to block it by any means, you won't get it through this year at all. They escalate, you end up with public meetings, rioting, it's forced through. It does become violent, but the thing is, both sides, they are trying to block everything he does. He knows he's got a year of office. There's the big expectations, not just of himself, but also of Pompey and Crassus and plenty of other people, to force this through. So Caesar's consulship becomes troubled early on. There are riots, there are violence, though it's not on the scale of the Clodius and Milo violence that will come in later years. It's not revolutionary. In the end, you know, Bibulus withdraws home and basically says he keeps on seeing bad omens, so everything Caesar does is illegitimate. They're basically preparing for when Caesar's no longer consul and to attack retrospectively everything he does. And it's part of the nature of Roman politics, but it's not terribly effective as a way of governing any state. And then Caesar will go off to Gaul, and then at the end of the time in Gaul, we'll have the build-up to the civil war, which we'll return to in a minute. But let's think about what Caesar's been doing right up to this point, because even then, yes, he's consul, he wants to be a successful consul, he wants to bring in these laws, but this is very far short of overthrowing the Republic. It's always tempting, and it's so easy for us to impose a stronger, more rigid sense of meaning on terms like republic than the Romans meant. It's res publica in Latin, the public thing almost. I think commonwealth probably gives the idea the best. The idea, what we all share, you know, our sort of communal spirit, identity, success or failure. Res publica does not mean the very specific form of government that has developed, although that is hallowed by tradition, is seen as very important, this idea that no one individual or group will have permanent supreme power. That's very important, and that obviously is something that Caesar will eventually unbalance completely. But nothing he's done up to his consulship or even his time in Gaul, the 10 years he spends there campaigning, Caesar presents those campaigns as the proper behavior of a Roman governor in the field. Everything I do is for the good of Rome, the interest of us, the interest of our allies, because if we don't protect our allies, if we don't benefit them, why should anybody be our ally? Why should anybody be our friend? And these are successive threats, and you know, he invokes the Cimbri and Teutones, he invokes Spartacus even in book 1 of when he's talking about we're facing Germans. Well, we've fought them before, you know, when they were the runaway slaves. Many of whom were descendants of Cimbri, Teutones, and something. But as far as he's concerned, this is, I am doing the right thing for Rome. I am the servant of the Republic, very distinguished, very capable one, incredibly, you know, flamboyant, brave one, but I am a servant of the Republic, doing what is right for the Republic, for the common good. We also have the whole popular appeal. Caesar is a popularis. I've talked about this elsewhere, and I expect we'll have to do more on it, because there are still plenty of older books around where you have this idea of political parties, optimates and populares, sort of conservatives and radicals, that simply doesn't work. The optimates, the best men, or the boni, the good men as they call themselves, these are terms people apply to themselves, or those they very much admire. You know, you get the sort of newcomer really who feels very inferior to the aristocracy, but in what he sees as a good way. And that's something to which I aspire. Maybe in generations of my family can become like that. You know, they're proper gentlemen, they're proper aristocrats, they know what they're doing, they're not perfect, but they've got more style, they've got more dignity than us, you know, they should be at the top of Roman society. It's just I'd quite like to join in as well, but be part of that, not overthrow it. Again, who is included in this group will vary a lot depending on your perspective. Popularis is more a style of politics. It isn't a party. Catiline's a popularis, but that doesn't mean that he and Caesar are firm allies or part of some similar group. Now, I know you could argue that in modern political parties, when they do exist, some of the bitterest rivalries come within parties rather than between opposing ones, and often some of the closest friendships people make in Parliament and I dare say elsewhere are with people on the opposing benches rather than their own colleagues, because they're not rivals in the same way, and they don't scream at each other in inter-party meetings. Not always, but that can happen. Popularis is, again, a term you tend to apply to other people. So rather than optimates, yes, I like to feel that I'm one of the best men. Popularis is something you say about someone else, mainly. Occasionally people will use it as a mark of pride. And it means somebody who is interested in and will support causes that are seen to be popular with the majority. But it's a little bit like these days. I know I've probably said this before, but it strikes me as a useful illustration. If in the media today you describe a politician, a policy or a party as popular, then that's seen as a compliment. That is a good thing. If instead you use the word populist, that implies direct criticism, because the implication is that the wrong people, however many of them there are supporting this individual. So it's very much a judgment call on the basis of the speaker. So populist is criticism. Popularis is often rather like that. You're saying, oh, well, you know, a lot of people like him, but nobody good, you know, not the boni, not the good men, not the optimates, not the best men. It's just the rabble, you know, the mob, ordinary people. Any of these things that can be imbued with all sorts of dripping contempt because they happen to support something you don't like, with which you disagree. Caesar has consistently championed popularis causes. He's done that in terms of land reform. He's done that in terms of the tribunician bills that gave Pompey these major commands against the pirates and then later Mithridates. But bear in mind, people like Cicero have spoken in favour, particularly of the latter. This doesn't mean you're some raving revolutionary through doing this. Quite a lot of people, even within the Senate, there are plenty of populares within the Senate. And the optimates see themselves as a small, exclusive group because, after all, not everybody can be the best men. Caesar has also championed the rights of provincials on several occasions, speaking up and prosecuting corrupt governors. Again, see, you don't often win those cases because all the odds are stacked in favour of the governor, who is a senator and has got lots of connections. But nevertheless, you're making the point that we have a responsibility. Yes, Rome is an empire, and it should be. Rome's power is good. Expanding it is good. But we have a responsibility. You can think back to the Gallic commentaries where Caesar talks about being natural for the Gauls to fight for freedom and fight against him. But it's equally natural for him to want to increase Roman power. You know, he doesn't see those as blocking each other. They are opposed, but that just means that, well, he's fighting for his country, I'm fighting for my country. That's the natural thing. We should both be doing this. My country wins because we're Rome and we're better and we deserve to, but that doesn't mean that he's doing anything dishonourable. He's doing the natural human thing. There is a sense, you get it reflected with Cicero as well at this time, and with Caesar, a sense of responsibility that, oh yes, we do have this empire, but we've got to treat people well. That's partly because it's more efficient that way. They're more likely to be peaceful, they're not going to rebel, therefore they'll give us the taxes, the levies we want, and we don't have to spend money on big garrisons there. And they'll also give us allied troops and whatever we need at any stage. We don't want to be keeping on fighting the areas that we've already come to subdue. But there is also a sense that our dignity, our reputation requires this. And the practical thing, I mean, it's why, yes, you can look at the pirate command for Pompey as being this radical move, or, you know, it's all for the ambition of Pompey. But Pompey did a very good job and solved a serious problem that had huge implications for trade, for travel throughout the Mediterranean. And just, you know, it doesn't look good if you're claiming we're this great power and yet pirates are snubbing their nose at you, they're raiding you, they're kidnapping people, ransoming them, all this sort of thing, routinely. So popularis causes are not necessarily way out of mainstream. They can be very widely supported. It's just that the popularis term tends to be one of abuse. So that mainly you're saying, oh, well, you know, only the wrong people want this. In fact, often it's very large numbers of people who want this, quite probably a majority. And many of them are not just, oh, they're all the poor or the rabble or the uneducated. There are plenty of other senators, other elite people, as well as equestrians, other well-to-do people who are supporting all of these things. So Caesar is part of that. And it's another way of getting attention because it would be much easier to be conventional all the way through. Just do what the optimates want, and he'd probably have an okay career because of his talent, but it might not be so spectacular. Caesar doesn't want okay, he wants to stand out. That doesn't mean that he wants to stand out in a way that isn't traditional, that he doesn't just want to go on to consulship, triumph, he's still young enough, another consulship, another war, perhaps another triumph. You know, other people have done this in the past. It's rare, but that's what makes it all the more valuable. But it has happened. You can be the new Scipio Africanus. You can be the new Flamininus, or whoever it might be, Claudius Maximus, Fabius, Cunctator from the Hannibalic War going back. Even before things go horribly wrong in the civil wars, you can be the next Marius and do these terrific things to the Republic and be celebrated. every time somebody's done something, then if you want to be the most successful Roman that's ever been, which is the natural desire to excel of any aristocrat, it's how they're raised, then you've got to go one better. So nothing he's doing at this point is revolutionary, is at all directed to overthrowing the Republic as it stands at that point. In fact, quite the contrary, it's about rising to the top. Winning the game, the political game that the Cursus Honorum is a reflection of that, doing the best you can, being the best, most successful Roman nobleman around. And everybody's saying you are a great servant of the state. That's the message of the commentary. Caesar should be honored because Caesar is a great servant of the Republic. He's doing this for us, in our interest, in the interest of the state. Obviously that changes, and we haven't got time to go into the whole build-up to the Civil War and the breakdown of the relationship between Caesar and Pompey. Without that, it probably wouldn't have happened. There would still have been bitter opponents of Caesar, but if Pompey had been willing and made it clear to Caesar that he could be trusted to back Caesar and allow him to go from Gaul straight into another consulship and therefore be immune from prosecution, then there probably wouldn't have been a civil war. What would have happened in later years, who knows? But Pompey's getting on a bit. Caesar's no longer young. Another campaign, one of them going against the Parthians, as everybody was suggesting, that was probably a wise thing to do in the circumstances by Roman standards, then who knows? But it is easy to see within that a path where Caesar simply goes on winning more and more honours, but conventional ones. Spectacular, exceptional, incredibly rare, but it's Caesar being a Roman magistrate, a Roman aristocrat, a servant of the Republic, and becoming the most distinguished senator around, the man with greatest auctoritas, the man with greatest reputation. That path is not followed because he feels himself backed into a corner. His opponents think that he will quit, he will give in, he won't press it to the point of violence, or if he does, they can defeat him. He thinks that he can keep on pushing them and they will eventually back down, let him stand for the consulship. It's very hard to see what could have been so terrible if they'd allowed that to happen, particularly because we know with hindsight what did happen. In the event when they did block him, when they were intransigent, think of that notable vote where the vast majority of senators present vote for both Caesar and Pompey to disarm to try and avoid a civil war, and only 22 vote that only Caesar should disarm and Pompey should keep. I think compared to about 370 odd, I think. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Most people don't want a civil war. Most people aren't bitter opponents of Caesar or bitter supporters, confirmed fervent supporters of Caesar. Most people just want to get on with things because they've all got their own ambitions as well, and they don't want a civil war because unless you're desperate, who would? There are a few people who are desperate like that and who do want it. This will then lead to dictatorship, partly because that's fighting the civil war, and then because, well, what am I going to do with the state afterwards? So Caesar stumbles into this in a way. There is no sense at all that this is a plan from the beginning. Nothing in his career up until this point has suggested that. However, aspects of his career should have shown to everybody that this isn't the sort of man who gives in lightly. Giving in and saying, okay, I've lost, fair enough, it's a fair cop gov, is not how Roman aristocrats are raised. They win so many wars against foreign opponents because the Romans do not quit. They won't quit against Pyrrhus, they won't quit against Hannibal, they won't even quit against Cimbrian Teutones or more recent other threats. They keep going, they keep fighting, and eventually the other side cracks and gives in or is destroyed. That's a great mentality for fighting foreign wars, but it does mean that once you start fighting against yourselves, once you start having civil wars and violent political struggles, then people aren't going to quit then either. It's what makes them so vicious when very often there's no real ideology involved. Remember, the Civil War starting in 49 is about whether or not Caesar should have a continued political career. There aren't really broader issues beyond that. Some people think, no, we can't stand this, and they're saying this will be the end of the state, this will be the end of democracy, all this sort of thing. Same sort of ridiculous over-the-top rhetoric you'll often get these days. I don't like this man, but he's had the impudence to do really well, or even worse, he's won an election, then that means the system is wrong. All of that is there, but nothing Caesar has done has suggested any concerted plan that I can see the Republic is in a state and I need to reform it. He does appear, he shows every sign of having been happy to have accepted success and glory in traditional ways, under the traditional terms, which doesn't mean he's not bringing in land legislation, other reforms, the reform on the law of how governors should behave during his consulship, which will then be confirmed in the dictatorship. There are issues that he feels need addressing, but this is not a wholesale reform of the entire system. And in many respects, what he does as dictator is much less radical than what Sulla had done before. Sulla is always clothed as the traditionalist, the man who tries to restore the balance, put the Senate back in charge, but he doesn't do a very good job of it, partly because the main essence of his reform is to almost double the size of the Senate and pack it with his supporters and exclude his opponents and their descendants. When you do that, you fundamentally alter the balance of the Senate and the balance of its debate, because although he increases the number of quaestorships, praetorships and the like, there are still only 2 consuls. There will still, it just means that with more senators, even fewer of them will win high office. And therefore, in a sense, it reinforces the power of the optimates as the best men, the most distinguished, the big families, the former magistrates are now a smaller fraction of the Senate, but they still have the same prestige. There are a lot more run-of-the-mill backbench senators, pedari, the men who just walk, never got asked their opinion, they vote, but that's it. Far more of them. That's an imbalance, and the Senate doesn't work too well. Now, again and again in those decades, the Senate ignores major problems that everybody seems to acknowledge exist because it doesn't want somebody to get the credit of solving them. And it tries to suppress the spectacularly successful so that there's more to go around for everybody else. It's much less balanced than it had been before. But again, within that system, I talk about this in the Caesar biography and elsewhere, when you have the famous debate over the Catilinarian conspirators, with Caesar arguing that we shouldn't break the law and just execute them without trial because they're Roman citizens, we should arrest them, hold them prisoner until we can do that, and then decide what to do then, but not immediate extra-legal execution. Cato stands up and argues the exact opposite, saying these people are terrible rebels, there should be no mercy. Cato is young, seeking election. Caesar's just been elected. They're both doing the same thing. Although they argue diametrically opposed views, they're basically trying to make themselves famous. Caesar, from the point of view in that there were rumors that he'd been involved with Catiline, he dressed like them, they'd copied him. He was seen as a popularis. He'd supported some of these measures that had also been supported by Catiline and his people. And there were rumors of involvement, yet while Crassus won't turn up to the Senate, Caesar not only arrives in the Senate, but when there's a debate about the fate of the arrested men, instead of being a good little boy and proving his loyalty to the state by being virulent in his condemnation and saying, yeah, kill them all, he actually argues against the trend of the debate and says, let's stick to the letter of the law and not do this, and let's arrest them and deal with them later. Hold them prisoner until then. There's a bit more to it than that, but that's the essence of it, which is very much draw attention to me, look at me. Yes, people have rumoured this, but I'm still trying to do what's right. This is the legal way of doing it. May not be popular, but this is the right thing, and trying to persuade people to that. Cato comes in from the other point of view. All these famous men have made the argument for execution, but now the debate's shifting the other way. So I can be the man who turns things around and gets all the credit for persuading the Senate to vote for execution, which he does. Cicero is quite sniffy with Brutus later on, where Brutus describes the debate and makes Cato the sort of central figure in this, whereas Cicero feels it really ought to be him because he and other distinguished people had been leading the debate towards execution before Cato comes along, and Cato was still junior. So they're playing the same game, they really are. And they're not so very different, even though Cato in particular comes to loathe Caesar. And that's a personal thing as well as a political thing. They just don't get on. And you will see these visceral hatreds in modern politics where some people clearly just despise each other. And it makes every debate, dispute, political argument between them, all the more vicious. But you cannot see, before the Civil War, a Caesar who is plotting revolution. It simply isn't there. Even when people are trying, with hindsight, they are basically saying, oh, well, he's doing all of this, but that's what happens later. Yes, Caesar's spectacular. Yes, he wants to go to the top, but you really can see this as a very traditional ambition done in a fairly traditional way. That changes with the dictatorship, and obviously he gets supreme power. He is in a position to reform the state, to alter things, to make a revolution happen if he wants to. But as I said before, if you actually look at what he does, then it's not all that much. Well, we have a couple of big problems. One is that we know that Augustus is going to come later on, and that he will pass far more sweeping legislations, far grander reforms. The problem is that they will also be, it'll be a lex Julia, a Julian law, if he passes it, because he's Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus later on, Divi Filius, son of the divine Julius. When Julius Caesar passed the law, it was a lex Julia. With hindsight, we hear about these laws, we don't know who actually passed them. How much did Caesar plan and actually implement, or plan and not implement, that was subsequently implemented by Augustus? What did Caesar want in the long run is a very difficult question to ask. To a great extent because of the propaganda war that occurred around the time of his assassination, and particularly afterwards, where you have a civil war between men claiming to be Caesar's heirs, Caesar's successors, like Antony, like Octavian Augustus, and the conspirators and others who've backed those who assassinated him, or were the ones who assassinated him, and saying, well, we needed to do that. So there's an awful lot of pamphlets being going around. It's this where you don't really get mention of Caesarion in Caesar's lifetime at all, or in anything you can trace back to Caesar's lifetime. It's only afterwards. A lot of these things, a lot of the claims that he wants to move the capital to Alexandria, he wants a law passed that will allow him the right to sleep with as many women as he likes and have legitimate children with any of them. Apart from the propaganda element of all of this, where you're basically either saying, isn't it a tragedy they went and murdered this really nice man who was going to do wonderful things for us, never done anything wrong, was a great servant of the state, or we had to do it. This man was turning into a monster. He'd already done all these terrible things. It was going to get worse and worse. Neither of you has any great need to be 100% truthful in any of this. Second point that is all too often forgotten is that while Caesar is dictator, he is still fighting the civil war. The last battle does not occur until Munda in 45. He gets to spend a fair bit of 46 in Rome, but even then you've had the Thapsus campaign earlier on. Most of the time he is away. He spends relatively short periods of time in Rome and in Italy, and some of the times he's away, he's busy on campaign or he's besieged in Alexandria. He is completely out of things. He is not directing things in a detailed way. So there isn't time to do all that much. He does a remarkable amount, reforming the calendar, for goodness sake, that again works and lasts through with the minor modifications by Pope Gregory. This is our calendar, created by or under Julius Caesar, with at least some personal role within it. A lot of other legislation, again, the law about governors' behavior remains the law for centuries. The colonies he sets up are successful. We don't know quite how many of them actually were put into effect. The building program is only partly done before he's murdered. A couple of things are worth mentioning. If Caesar wanted a radical reform of the state, a revolution, and wanted a permanent dictatorship, then there isn't much sign. Yes, he's got these powers for life. And then you have all the controversy about, the Lupercal, the crown, does he want to be king? The demonstration of publicly refusing it is that, again, it shows how difficult it is to do anything when you get to this position, because if he'd accepted it, well, that shows he wants to be king. Rejecting it, oh, well, he really wanted it, but the crowd wasn't on his side, this sort of thing. The critics win either way. Whoever set that up wins either way. The I am not king but Caesar, comment to the crowd. We know Augustus is going to come along, and as the heir to Caesar, as the son of Caesar, is going to win the civil war, become the first emperor. The young Octavius has a few prominent jobs. He speaks at a funeral, he presides over a festival, he's being educated, but he's still only in his teens. He is too young to have an active role in Roman politics. He is very certainly not marked out as a potential political heir in any open way by Julius Caesar, and nobody even claims this even after Caesar's murder, not even Octavius himself. In Caesar's will, he is not adopted. He is made the principal heir of Caesar's private estate, and under the terms of that, it was quite normal to take the person's name. That was clearly the plan. So he would have become Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus if he'd chosen to. But people like Brutus, Brutus has been adopted as well by Caepio, but sticks with his own name because that's the famous family name. There is no way within the Roman system, when the young Octavian Augustus goes to Rome and claims that he wants to inherit and succeed to all of Caesar's honours and powers as well as his private estate, there is no basis for that in Roman law, and Caesar has not tried to create one. Caesar didn't plan on dying in 44 BC, so you could see everything he's doing as still a work in progress. Perhaps he had a clear idea, but it's not, whilst he doesn't resign like Sulla, and supposedly again you have this comment, May date to another time, that Sulla didn't know his letters, didn't know his alphabet, basically he didn't know his basic political rules when he resigned. And you could say very clearly, Sulla resigned, bits of his constitution started falling apart almost immediately. Caesar doesn't do that, but that doesn't mean that he expected somebody else to become dictator after him. It doesn't even mean that, say, 10 years' time, when he was that much older, that he wouldn't resign then. His dictatorship is about getting the state running again and getting the courts working, the Senate issuing decrees, dealing with all the problems that are coming to them from Rome, from Italy, and from the provinces. There's this backlog of, there's a dispute between two cities in Asia Minor, say, how do we resolve it? The governor has passed it up to the Senate, what's going to be done? Do you recognize this dynast as the heir to father who's just died, as a replacement? What land, what territory does he control? What's the status he's given in the Roman system? All of this has been severely disrupted by the civil war, partly because people have been backing the wrong side. So now they're trying to find out, well, I was on the losing side, but can I still keep my power? Is my city still going to have reasonable terms of treaty with Rome? All this sort of thing. Cicero talks about being thanked by representatives from communities that have been given what they wanted by a vote of the Senate where he was named, even though there has in fact been no debate, no thing. Caesar has simply decided that's what I want done, get on with it, and then presented it, given it a veneer of proper method, proper rulings of doing that. And you can see that as well. This is Caesar with no patience at all for the Senate, the old ways of doing things, just getting on with it, doing what he wants. The man who's been in command of an army for years is just used to giving orders, not consulting with people. And there's probably an element of that. But there's also an element of there is so much to do. If I wait to do it in the traditional, formal, and very slow way, then we'll be here for years, and the backlog will only get longer. So to get us back up and running again, which he moves towards doing, but then he gets murdered and the civil war happens, so the system will break down again. But there is significant progress towards stability in that brief period. It will eventually be achieved under Augustus. There's so much for the Senate to do that it hasn't been doing very well because it's been busy with civil wars and trying to kill each other, or trying to keep your head down and not get killed by either side in the case of an awful lot of senators. So Caesar does treat traditional institutions with disdain, but that doesn't seem to be, there's no effort to say, right, we don't need a Senate anymore, let's just forget about it and get on with it. Most of his methods are very traditional. The honours that are voted to him are exceptional, though again they are progressions from what has occurred before. You could even see that Caesar has been voted more days of public thanksgiving than any commander in the history of Rome, including Pompey. And it's this escalation again. Once you start voting somebody 5 days, then the next day, oh, this is another good victory, let's give him 10 days or 20 days and so on. But he hasn't, the system has been pushed to an extreme, but he hasn't fundamentally altered it. So all in all, when you look even at the dictatorship, there is not clear evidence for a major revolutionary intent, which is not to mean that he might not have moved and developed onto that, but it's hard to see it there. So from that point of view, you don't even see Caesar as a revolutionary at that stage in his life, that final stage in his life, when he is dictator, effectively sole ruler, effectively monarch. So when we're looking at Julius Caesar, you can actually give more than one answer to questions like, is he a friend of the Republic? You could argue, thank you, Augustus the cat. All right. Yeah, I know. Anyway, you could argue that he is always working for the good of the Republic. That's how he presents himself in the commentaries. And after all, when he reforms something, when he changes it, you could still argue that's for the good of the Republic. Remember, res publica, it's commonwealth. It's the shared thing. It is not a rigidly fixed institution where you cannot change anything at all under any circumstances. There is not a formal constitution you're dealing with as a single document whereby any change to that, other than okay, how do we understand this? A legal ruling is a major thing. Rome isn't like that. There has been rather more change at Rome over the centuries than we tend to allow. As a minor example, even before Sulla, you'd had the increase in the number of praetorships because the state needed them. You know, there were more jobs to do, therefore we need more magistrates. So, friend of the Republic, enemy of the Republic, Caesar would probably say he's a friend to the Republic in which he believes, the best form of Republic, and it needs to be refined, it needs to be improved. More than anything else, you see with Caesar less about institutions than a sense of let's get this working. Let's get the courts working, let's get the debate room, let's get colonization program, let's make things happen. And there is perhaps the sense that you've got this man who's been in charge of major wars for a long time, and has got used to having to plan all the logistical side of that, the financial side of this, as well as the strategic military side of it, that let's just get on with it and do it. Let's get to the end result rather than let's do the day-to-day politics. But unlike Pompey, Caesar has done the day-to-day politics in the early years of his career. He's done everything the normal way. He knows about that. There probably is a lack of patience later on. But then, if you keep poking somebody with a stick, how do you expect them to respond? And from Caesar's perspective, it's looking at the dead Pompeians after Pharsalus, they wanted this, but from my army, they would have passed judgment on me. You know, I've been provoked, I've been picked on, I've been a good servant of the state, I've done everything the legal way. You know, you're complaining about my consulship, but people voted for me, people voted for those laws, everything went through, the attempts to block them were ridiculous, spiteful, and those of a small minority. Or you could take the Catonian point of view and say, well, yes, but we still, you know, we could claim some legal justification in doing this. You're not supposed to overrule tribunes, all of this sort of thing. But apart from that, I just didn't agree with what you were doing. So it was my right to fight you tooth and nail. And I was doing the right thing because I'm serving the Republic. So both sides can prove that they are serving the true Republic. And the extent to which Caesar is planning a radical change is quite hard to see. More and more as the years have passed and coming back to this period again and again, to me, so much of what Caesar does seems very traditional. And even the popularis element, the new causes, are within the tradition of flexibility within the Roman system, where they've done this sort of thing before. You know, they have had land distributions before. Caesar isn't coming up with all of this. There is clearly a serious problem where you end up with lots of people with little or no work, relying on government handouts in Rome, and they're an unstable element, whereas if we sent them out somewhere, gave them a farm, it would, A, put them on a better footing to be good citizens, produce the next generation of soldiers, all this sort of thing. But also, if we put them on colonies in some of the provinces, it helps to develop those provinces, both economically, but also from a point of view of our control. You know, we now have these big settlements of Romans there. Not so very different from what Rome had done in its early expansion throughout Italy. Slightly different way of it then, but it's a similar idea. So all in all, I don't see Caesar as a revolutionary. Even at that later stage, I think he's still trying to think very much in terms of what's going to work. He's more of a practical man than a theorist in many respects. He doesn't seem to make any moves towards preparing an heir. Now, if he was going to choose Octavius, if he thought he was the most talented of his young relatives, which he clearly does, to make him the principal heir, he is still far too young to do anything. But Caesar is not trying to flip a switch and make this into a monarchy. And again, we forget that Augustus has more than 40 years to create the Augustan regime and to embed it in very firmly. So comparing what he does to what Caesar does and saying, well, Augustus was right and Caesar was wrong, completely ignores that. It misses the point. So what about one of the other themes? When Caesar didn't execute all his opponents, was this being nice or being weak? Obviously, from the point of view of the Antony, Lepidus and Octavian later on, they will publicly declare when they're announcing the prescriptions that Julius Caesar pardoned his enemies, was kind to them, gave them his clemency, and they paid him back by murdering him. So we're not going to make the same mistake, and you don't deserve that treatment anymore. We're going to do a video on the Italian campaign in 49 BC in Corfinium within the next few weeks. It might even be next week. When we look at that, talk a lot about how much surprise there was that when Caesar did march into Italy, he didn't behave like Sulla or, to be honest, like Marius, like Pompey, like the other leaders in civil wars who've been pretty brutal. Remember, Pompey was nicknamed the Young Butcher in his early career under Sulla, and afterwards he executed Brutus's father in a way that was seen as ignoring all citizens' rights. Caesar doesn't do that. Now, it's politically advantageous in the civil war is that whereas the opponents are saying you're either for us or against us, if you don't back us, you're an enemy, Caesar is saying, unless you're actively fighting me, I do not want to fight you. So that's a good way of winning people over. But is it more than that? I think it's his nature as well. Yes, he's been savage sometimes in Gaul, but he's also been merciful in other situations. He's been pragmatic, really, in his use of violence and atrocity in Gaul, rather than moral, fundamental way, but it's different fighting a civil war. But even then, you could argue that he's milder than some Roman commanders. Not that saying very much. But in the civil war, I think the one thing, it comes back to a sense of the practical, that what Caesar wants is for the state to work again, for the res publica to work again. As I say, he's making no move at all to prepare for a successor to himself. So there is no clear indication that he sees the position he has created, the honours he has awarded to him by the Senate, by vote, but nevertheless, we presume this is what he wants. Another thing to remember is that when Caesar's murdered, he's about to embark on a war against first of all the Danube, then against the Parthians. He has named the magistrates for the next 3 years. So, it's a major interference with the way elections are supposed to work, but it's also organising things. It's making sure that there will be appointees that hopefully will not start a new civil war. It's that sense of getting things going, and often it will be superficially that things are back to normal. He's issuing these decrees, deciding the fate of provincial communities and leaders, and it's presented as if the Senate okay, Augustus wants to go out, right, there you go, out through the door. But also, it's done quickly. He isn't going through the formalities, he's getting the job done. If he's going to be away for 3 years, he has to be confident that there won't be a new faction against him that raises an army that's ready to fight him when he comes home. The system has to work without him being there to make every decision. So he needs to rely on people. And there's an element, I think it's more brassing it out in that sense of, well, I've got to be confident. I've got to show people that I trust you to do the right thing, to think of Rome, not of your personal ambitions, not of your views of me. Get on with it, keep the state running, keep the system running, keep the empire going while I'm away, when I'm not here, looking over your shoulder to make every decision. I'm still out there, I'll come back, I'll be back in a few years' time, I'll still have my big army that by then hopefully will be even more successful, having imposed a peace on the Parthians. So it's a sense again of the practical. This needs to work. If this needs to work, I can't be there to make every decision all the time, and I can't be there to threaten everybody all the time. So therefore I've got to trust you. And look how nice I am trusting you. You know, you didn't get this from Sulla. Sulla just killed everybody he didn't like and appointed his toadies instead. And look what a hash they made of things. So I think there is an element of practicality in the same way, dismissing his bodyguard, traveling through the streets of Rome, being available, being accessible. You know, he was not well protected. He was easy to murder, relatively speaking. That all shows confidence that it's rather like, you know, these quotes that he supposedly made, Brutus can wait a while for my head, you know, but Brutus is shrewd enough to understand that it isn't in Rome's interest to have me out the way. I am the stability at the moment. Might not be there forever. You know, I will die. I haven't marked out an heir. I haven't said there's going to be a dictator all the time, that the system has changed forever. It's just that an extension almost of the idea of having a dictator for an emergency, this is a long emergency, we need to get going again, we need to stop killing each other, and we need to get the state functioning, then I will do all of this, but I need to trust you. So hopefully you've got the sense to see that it's to your advantage for me to still be alive. With me, there's stability. If I go, there will be civil war again. And that same prediction that some of his supporters refer to afterwards that proves exactly right. Once he's out of the way, people start tearing at each other's throats again. And you end up with worse civil war than you've had before. So he's trying to do that. The problem is you have the deep-seated emotion of people like Brutus, Cassius, Decimus Brutus, and others who just resent so much the existence of someone like Caesar with those powers. They must murder him, and have this rather naive view that, oh, well, he's out the way, the Republic will just function. So I think it's not softness or squeamishness, because, you know, he has killed people when he's felt that they needed killing. On the other hand, it's rather more admirable. Yes, it's pragmatic, but it's a little bit like a dictator in reality who succeeds for a long time. You either have to rule utterly by fear, or you have to give a degree of freedom, a degree of trust to others. You know, the fear is still there, but it's a bit more in the background. Somewhere in between, where you're terrifying people, but you're not controlling them, and you're not so utterly ruthless all the time, that tends to be more dangerous. But I think it's that sign, and there is something. After all, Caesar had been a hunted fugitive under Sulla. You feel it would be nice to think there's an element where he's thinking, well, we need to behave better than this. You know, this doesn't work. This isn't a good way of doing things. I can do better. There's another element that sometimes, again, it's almost a very traditional way of a Roman aristocrat thinking. Caesar knew that he was going to be compared to Sulla. He even does it himself in a few of the quotes attributed to him. Sulla's the only dictator who's lasted, having established himself by force. Caesar has now done the same thing. So the person to beat, the person to show that you are a better Roman, a better aristocrat, a better servant of the state, in this capacity is in fact Sulla. So there may well be an element where he's doing this to show, well, I'm not Sulla, you are a lot better off, so, you know, stick with me. You may not like me too much, you may not like what's happened, but see the big picture, see the sensible thing, work together for the good of Rome, and, you know, we'll all benefit from that. Comes back to that sense of, I am a servant of the state. So I think it's more to do with that. Now, when we come on to the question of what happens after Caesar's death, you know, are the people still on Caesar's side or not? First thing we've got to say is that we can't really talk about the people in the same way that we cannot talk about the Senate and imply that every single member of that group thinks exactly the same way, has exactly the same ideas. There is that problem, and it's partly a success of their propaganda campaign and their memory at the time, that people will often talk about Caesar fighting against the Senate in the Civil War. That Cato and even Pompey, Metellus Scipio, these others become the Senate. Most senators didn't go to war. The majority of the Senate, remember there's between 500 and 600 of them at this time, try and keep a low profile and stay out of it. Far more of the distinguished ones, and quite a few minor ones, join Caesar's opponents and fight on that side rather than for Caesar, but an awful lot of people are just trying to keep a low profile. Even famously, the Claudius Marcellus, the consul who had gone and presented in 50 BC a sword to Pompey when there was a false rumor that Caesar had invaded Italy, presenting this to Pompey as you must protect the state, he remains neutral. He doesn't fight for the Pompeians during the Civil War. So we're too simplistic. With the people, you're dealing with a much, much bigger group. The liberators clearly misread the level of support they had in the population as a whole, in that the liberty they proclaim is very much the liberty of the elite. And ultimately, when you think about it, the cause, the idea they're murdering Caesar is because Caesar is dictator. And you get this reflection in Shakespeare. It's not that he's done anything terrible. And most of what he does, there isn't a rush to repeal everything once he's dead. And in fact, they very quickly, okay, it's a political deal, and they're trying to make sure Antony doesn't fight them, and Lepidus and others. They very quickly pass legislation to make legal everything, confirm the legality of everything Caesar's done as dictator. Now, obviously, what a politician says one day and what he's going to say and do a week later are not necessarily the same thing, but it's worth remembering. There is that context. There is not an absolute rejection of all that Caesar has done. Perhaps there is fear about what he might do. The primary objection is that there is a dictator, that this violation of that fundamental principle that no one individual should have permanent supreme power, Caesar has got it. Dictator traditionally was for 6 months, Caesar's got it for life. And he's had all these other powers and honors as well. He's been treated, in honors that are pushing towards the semi-divine, to the monarchic, all of this sort of thing. But that concern is primarily a concern for leading senators. Again, doesn't mean they're all cynical about this, but had Brutus and Cassius, they've murdered Caesar and then gone on, the Republic has been restored as they seem to imagine it would just spring back into life, they would be the leaders of that Republic. They would be the pick of the optimates, the pick of the best men, because they had done this great thing. But also because of the families they come from, the connections they've got. Nobody, Decimus Brutus, for instance, very quickly goes off to take his province in Cisalpine Gaul in the aftermath of Caesar's death. Brutus and Cassius are both praetors. They are, they don't want to give up the honors they've been given or awarded by Caesar, or the things they've got under Caesar. So that cause is a fairly narrow one. And there would be other Roman citizens who perhaps thought of this as a matter of principle and agreed with them. And clearly there are. And we have to be careful not to write off everybody simply because they're an equestrian, let alone if they're on the fringes of that order or lower, they're minor gentry in the towns of Italy, but they're Roman citizens, that these people don't have a strong concern for the right way of doing things, for tradition. And you can see that these are clearly, it's the class that produces so many of the centurions and others who feature so prominently and so heroically in Caesar's commentaries. He's addressing this group of people. And there are political arguments sometimes put into that as well. But on the whole, there is not a huge sigh of relief that Caesar is dead. Partly because Caesar has given stability. Like him or not, things have been better in the short period that the Civil War's over. And again, remember, Munda is only in 45. But you're not having armies marauding around Italy for a couple of years. They're not confiscated. And you don't have prescriptions, the death lists of Sulla, the confiscation of property, the settlement of veterans in all parts of Italy, things that will happen again after Caesar's death and as the civil wars break out again, that so disrupt. And you can see that, the horror of it all reflected in Propertius and Virgil and Horace, the poets of that era, that sense your farm can be confiscated and given to some rough soldier and all this sort of thing, and you lose your ancestral home. The shrines of your gods, the land your family has had for generations, just goes on the whim of a commander. People want stability, they want security, they want safety. Most of them are more concerned with their everyday lives than political theory. And an awful lot of people have done rather well and been treated rather well by Caesar in a way they had not been in the old days when the Sullan Senate was running things and ignoring big problems that when it suited them to. So there is clearly widespread support for Caesar and some support for the conspirators, but less. And the mood overall is that more people will end up backing Antony, Octavian, Lepidus. At least within Italy, the main support for the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, go out to their provinces and they rally armies there. You can't quantify this. We don't have the equivalent of statistics for how many citizens there are at this point and how everybody thinks. Again, I would tend to suspect that the majority probably just don't want to get involved and will prefer it all to go away and just want to get on with their lives and have relatively limited commitment to either side. But significant numbers do mourn Caesar. And that you have a reaction in the city of Rome where the conspirators end up feeling they've got to protect themselves on the Capitol, guarded by gladiators. It's difficult for them to come down. They do get to address the crowds, but it doesn't go that well. That you have rioting, that you have Caesar being cremated in the city itself, inside the Pomerium. This is not, you burned Clodius's body in the old Senate house, a mob of his supporters. Now, the crowd that does this for Caesar is a larger group, the impression, perhaps a more varied group, but it still isn't going to be everybody who lives in Rome. It's certainly not going to be every Roman citizen because they're scattered all over the world. So a significant body of people protest against the conspirators in favor of Caesar. You have Antony in the funeral speech, so marvelously done in Shakespeare, where the great emphasis on, when the poor hath cried, Caesar hath wept, ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Probably there is wider popular support for Caesar, significantly so, than there is for the conspirators. But it won't be 100%, it won't be simple. And whenever you see, film of a huge protest today in a capital city somewhere, it can be impressive, there can be an awful lot of people, but that's not everybody. Even a big group, most people don't bother to go out and protest at all about anything. And you might get a counter-protest arguing the opposite cause that's just as big, within days or even on the same day. And you do notice, there's the classic television trick where they do a close-up of faces and signs of protesters if there aren't many people in the crowd, and they do a long shot if they are, but sometimes they'll mix the two together to imply that the two groups are the same size, even when in fact one group is much bigger than the other. Usually they only do that if they sort of favour the group that's the minority. Anyway, that's another thing. It just remembers, I saw this in an example of this very clearly in Cardiff years ago. We had all the Countryside Alliance, they were called, protesting against the hunting ban, among other things. And they were marching through Cardiff city centre, and it took me a good 20 minutes to cross the road as these thousands and thousands of people came past. There was a counter-protest, anti-hunt protesters, and they fitted into the gateway of Cardiff Castle, which is, 20 feet across. There were a couple of dozen of them. That was it. When I saw that on the local news later on, it was presented close-up of the anti-hunting people, long shot of the others. It was presented as if two equal groups of people had protested on the same day, arguing opposite courses of action, but they were basically numbers were the same. Now, I didn't have skin in the game. I wasn't involved in either respect. I was simply there as an observer. But that was an utterly distorted view of what had happened, because there were, regardless of what it might mean about overall opinion, I've no idea about that, don't have the figures. One protest was very big indeed. You would think it was certainly thousands. You could just see that from basic counting of people and then waiting to see how long that procession took to come along. Quite possibly more. It may even have been tens of thousands. I don't know. I'm not claiming that. Against a few dozen. 30 or 40 people at the most. But it was presented because the BBC News coverage that was doing it obviously felt more sympathy, I think, probably because they're largely urban based, to that group, or they just wanted to appear to be unbiased. They actually were biased because they presented one group as exactly the same in numbers or very similar when it clearly wasn't. And you will see this again and again. It's a typical thing. Look, whenever you see a television report of a protest, when they do lots of close-ups, there probably aren't quite so many people there, but they want to give you, it gives an impression of more than when they do the aerial shots of the big columns. There's clearly a lot of people involved. Again, I'm not saying anything about the rights and wrongs of any particular cause or that sort of thing. Don't want to do modern politics. Damn, I'd forgotten to switch off my phone, but we're nearly at the end of this video, so I won't bother to go back and edit that out. that's not what this channel's about. It's not a place for me to sort of rant about my views about this, that, and the other in the modern world. I'm just trying to use these examples so that we can understand when we go to our ancient sources that what's presented as everybody feeling one particular way probably is nowhere near that simple. But the broad truth is that far more people seemed willing to support those who claimed to be the successors to Caesar than they were to support the conspirators. The conspirators did not have a flood of support from the wider population. And when you look at what they're arguing for, which is basically let's put us back in charge and let's run the empire for our benefit and the way we think it's like it, whereas like him or not, Caesar had done more for more sections of society. It doesn't mean he was right about everything. It doesn't mean he was fair to everybody, but more people were better off. And perhaps more than that, more people just wanted stability. They didn't want another civil war. So I think that's where we are. We'll finish with going back to that Livy comment earlier on with Seneca quoting Livy that, can you decide was it a good thing for Caesar to be born, or if he hadn't been born, would that have been better? And Seneca saying, well, it's just like the winds, they're there. The competitive system of the Republic, the idea that aristocrats are supposed to excel, that's going to produce people like Caesar. The circumstances of the 1st century BC, the post-Sullan world, are not created by Caesar. And there's no sign that he was determined on starting a civil war in 49 BC. He does try to negotiate repeatedly. Now, again, you could say, well, that's just, he wants to be seen to be in the right and then forced to fight. Maybe, who knows? But he's not set on civil war, partly because it's so risky. But also you do feel there are clear signs the way he's presenting himself that he would be entirely happy to be honored in a conventional way. He will have waited his 10 years between consulships, just like the Sullan law said you had to, and then gone on, and he's earned it because surely look at all the things he's done. He has been voted more days of public thanksgiving for his victories in Gaul than anybody else in Roman history. So how do you turn around from that to saying you're an enemy of the state when he hasn't actually done anything at that point? Only the people saying, well, this is what he wants to do. So you do feel it is a failure of perhaps not the system, but the people who are dominating the Republican system at that time, that they can't think, well, as Cicero would say repeatedly, if you wanted to fight Caesar, why make him so strong before you fight him? He's done all this legitimately. He has been voted these things by the Roman people. He's been given things by the Senate. He's been honored by both. And now you suddenly say he's an enemy of the state. We've got to suppress him. There is an illogic about it all. And unless you assume that, well, these people, they knew Caesar, they knew what he was really like, and therefore they're anticipating things. But you need a lot of faith to believe that someone like Cato really does know Caesar better than Caesar presents himself to the world. The big figure within this is Pompey's defection to Caesar's opponents, or his sense that he will no longer, he wants Caesar to sort of show submission to him if he's going to get Pompey's support, and Pompey's support hasn't always been very reliable. Think of Milo for an example. So that's what makes the Civil War happen. It needn't have happened. If it hadn't happened, I don't necessarily see there's any reason to think Caesar would have tried for dictatorship, monarchy, anything like that, rather than simply having a spectacularly successful career by traditional standards. So that's it. That's it for today. We've talked about several different issues related to questions about Julius Caesar. In my normal way, I've rambled on to all sorts of other things as well. But Caesar still continues to fascinate me. I spent several years writing a biography of him. I've delved into the period for other books as well. I keep coming back to it. It is just interesting. And there are so many things that it's very difficult to answer and pin down. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.